The smell reached him first. Royal physician Davin had walked the palace basement corridor 100 times in 20 years of service and had never smelled anything except stone and dust and the particular staleness of air that had been still for too long. But on the morning of the 14th day of the Eastern Plague crisis, descending to retrieve a crate of archived medical ledgers, he stopped halfway down the stairs because the air was different. It smelled like rain on forest earth, like green things growing in deep soil, like every living plant he had ever studied compressed into a single overwhelming presence that had absolutely no business existing 40 feet below the palace throne room. He followed it to the last door on the left, the one that had been assigned to the Omega herbalist 4 years ago and had not, to anyone's knowledge, been opened since. He pushed it open. The forest breathed at him. It filled the entire basement chamber from floor to ceiling, trees whose canopies pressed against stone, undergrowth so dense and varied it should have required decades of sunlight to achieve. Species he recognized from medical texts as extinct, species he did not recognize at all. Everything luminous and alive and impossible in the windowless dark. At the center of it, on a bed of thick green moss, a woman lay unconscious. Her hands were open at her sides, fingers curled slightly upward, as though even in collapse she was still reaching toward something growing. The forest breathed around her. It did not stop. Which country are you listening from? Please comment below. I would love to know how far this story reaches. The fourth bell rang at the same time every morning, and Sylvaine was always already awake. She had learned, in the first weeks of her basement assignment, that the palace's rhythm belonged to the floors above her and not to the space she occupied, and that trying to align her days with the sounds and schedules of a household that had collectively decided she did not exist was an exercise in the particular misery of half-belonging. So she had built her own rhythm instead. She woke before the fourth bell, in the deep quiet of the underground, and she went to her forest and she began. The beginning of her day was always the same. She moved through the outer growth first, the hardier species, the ones that required less sustained attention and more physical tending. She checked soil moisture with her hands rather than instruments, because her hands told her things instruments could not: the specific quality of saturation, the temperature gradient between surface and root zone, the faint biological hum of a plant that was thriving versus one that was working harder than it should. She pruned where pruning was needed. She redirected growth where the canopy was pressing too insistently against the stone ceiling. The ceiling was a problem she had been managing for 2 years. The forest had exceeded the chamber's vertical space in the second year of cultivation, and she had responded by training the larger specimens horizontally, coaxing their canopies to spread outward rather than upward, creating a layered green architecture that used every available inch of the underground space without destroying itself against the stone. It was not how these trees were meant to grow. But then, she reflected, nothing about this forest was growing the way it was meant to, and that had never stopped it. Her meals arrived at the top of the basement stairs twice daily, a tray left on the second step from the top, which she retrieved on her way between the forest and her small sleeping quarters at the corridor's far end. The person who left them never descended. She had not seen another person in the basement in 11 months, which was not a record. The record was 14 months, set in her second year. Before Davin had come down briefly to retrieve something from a storage room 3 doors down, and had nodded at her in the corridor with the vague acknowledgement of someone who could not quite recall why a person was where they were. She did not resent this. She had spent considerable time examining whether she resented it, and had arrived at an honest answer. She had resented it acutely for the first 6 months. And then the forest had grown large enough to require her full attention. And resentment was simply not a thing she could afford to carry when there was so much living work to do. Her name did not appear on the palace staff roster. She had checked this once. through a document that had arrived in a misdirected administrative bundle left at the top of the stairs. The bundle had been intended for the records office and contained a complete staff listing for the palace's lower service levels. She had found her name's absence with the same methodical attention she brought to finding missing species in a plant catalog, a gap where something should have been noted and filed. She had used the document to press a particularly stubborn seedling flat overnight and returned it to the stairs the following morning. By midday she was in the deep forest, in the oldest section, where the first species she had cultivated had reached their full growth and created a canopy dense enough that the air beneath it had its own quality, warmer, richer, saturated with the particular oxygen signature of plants that had been channeled to their maximum biological expression. She did her most precise work here, harvesting, processing, cataloging the medicinal compounds each plant produced. Her journals lined a shelf she had built from reclaimed wood at the forest's center, 12 volumes now, each one filled with her precise handwriting, documenting every species, every compound, every observation she had made across 4 years of cultivation. She had begun the journals as research documentation. They had become, over time, something else as well, a record of her days. Proof that she had been here and had not been idle and had not been defeated. Written in the language of plants because that was the language she trusted most. In the afternoon, the upper floor workers sometimes passed through the corridor outside her door. She could hear fragments of their conversations through the wood, kitchen gossip, scheduling complaints. The occasional mention of events in the world above that she filed away with the same quiet attention she gave everything. She heard herself mentioned once. One voice asking another what that Omega herbalist was still doing down there, and the other voice saying it had no idea, and a third voice saying it didn't matter because nobody ever went down there anyway. She had been tending a bloom of silverroot when she heard it. She had continued tending it without pause, smoothing the soil around its base with the flat of her thumb, feeling the plant's frequency hum steadily back against her touch. Nobody goes down there, she thought. And then, that is exactly why it works. That evening, checking the outer growth on her way to sleep, she found a new bloom she had not planted, a small, pale flower growing from a crack in the basement wall where stone met soil, reaching toward the forest's warmth with the determined optimism of something that had decided, on its own, that this was a good place to be. She crouched beside it for a long time. She did not channel into it. She simply let it grow in its own way, at its own speed, by its own choice. Some things, she had learned, grew best when you simply made space for them and trusted the rest to the plant. She had never intended to build something this large. In the beginning, 4 years ago, she had brought only what fit in the 2 bags she had been permitted to carry to her basement assignment: seeds, cuttings, her first 3 research journals, the small set of cultivation tools she had carried since her apprenticeship in the eastern settlements. The basement chamber was large by storage room standards, 40 feet long, 20 wide, with a ceiling that cleared her head by 8 feet at its lowest point. She had looked at it on the first day with the practical eye of a person who had cultivated in worse conditions and understood that space was only one variable among many, and not the most important one. The most important one was her. Verdant channeling was not a gift she had chosen or trained for or discovered through any dramatic event. It had simply always been present, the way left-handedness was present, a natural orientation, so fundamental to how she interacted with the world that she had not understood for years that other people did not experience plants the way she did. That the hum she felt when her hands were in the soil was not something everyone felt. That the way seeds responded to her touch, quickening, orienting, beginning their germination cycle days or weeks ahead of any natural timeline, was not simply good horticultural practice. She had understood it fully only when she had tried to teach a fellow apprentice and discovered that no matter how precisely she described the technique, the other woman could not replicate the results. The plant simply did not respond the same way. The frequency was not there. She had been 17. She had gone home and sat in her mother's garden for a long time, letting that understanding settle. In the basement, alone and unobserved for the first time in her professional life, she had let the gift run at its full capacity, and the results had exceeded even her own understanding of what she carried. The forest now occupied every square foot of the chamber. The canopy layer, trained horizontally across the ceiling in the wide, interlocking spread she had spent 2 years shaping, held 14 tree species. 6 of them listed in the Royal Medical Compendium as extinct for periods ranging from 80 to 300 years. She had grown them from seeds she had collected during her 12 years of field research. Seeds she had carried in small sealed packets in the innermost pocket of her field journal case, waiting for a space and a time. The middle layer held the medicinal shrubs and climbing species, the ones whose compounds addressed the kingdom's most persistent disease burdens. She moved through this layer now, in the quiet of mid-morning, checking each specimen with the combination of physical examination and channeled assessment that gave her a complete picture of their health and productivity. The Eastern Plague plant was here. She stopped beside it. Thornvale moss, a species the Royal Medical Compendium listed as last recorded in the 3rd century, whose primary compound was a broad-spectrum antimicrobial agent of a complexity that no laboratory synthesis had yet replicated. She had 3 healthy specimens, each one producing at full capacity, their deep blue-green fronds releasing the faint metallic scent that indicated peak compound concentration. She had known for 2 years that the eastern settlements would need this eventually. She had been preparing the compound in small batches and storing it in the cool section of the forest's northern wall. In sealed jars she labeled with the same precision she brought to her journals. There were 47 jars. She had hoped it would be enough. She moved deeper, to the section she thought of as the library, the plants whose properties she understood completely, whose documentation filled the most pages in her journals, whose cultivation she had refined to a precision that produced consistent and predictable results. Silverroot for fever reduction, more effective than any royal physician's compound by a documented factor of 3. Deep moss for the respiratory disease that swept the lower wards every winter, whose active compound the Royal Medical Council had been attempting to synthesize unsuccessfully for a decade. Grapevine, which addressed the nerve deterioration condition that affected aging wolves, and for which the current treatment protocol offered only symptom management, not resolution. She knew what these plants could do. She had documented it exhaustively. She had been documenting it in a basement where no one came, producing evidence that no one read, solving problems that the kingdom's official medical establishment was publicly failing to solve. And the particular quality of that situation, its absurdity, its waste, its specific injustice, was something she had examined honestly and then set aside because there was no productive use for it and the plants needed tending regardless. At the forest's deepest point, in the oldest section, grew the plant she did not understand. She came to it last, as she always did, with the specific combination of fascination and humility it consistently produced in her. It had appeared in the 3rd year, growing from soil she had not seeded, in a section of the forest floor she had left deliberately uncultivated. It was unlike anything in her journals, or her field research, or the Royal Medical Compendium, or the 3 additional reference texts she had memorized during her apprenticeship. Its leaves were a silver green she had no botanical name for. Its root system, when she had carefully examined the edges of it, extended in patterns that did not follow any growth logic she recognized. When she channeled near it, it channeled back. She had never experienced that before, a plant that did not simply receive her frequency, but responded to it, offered something in return, a reciprocal hum that moved through her hands and up into her chest with a warmth she could not classify or explain. She stayed near it longer than she should have this morning. When she finally straightened and stepped back, her hands were trembling. Not from the channeling. She had been trembling since before she came to the forest this morning. Since before yesterday. The trembling had started 3 weeks ago, faint enough to dismiss, and had been building with the slow persistence of something that could not be dismissed much longer. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs and breathed until they stilled. There was too much to do to stop now. The Eastern plague was worsening. The Thornvale compound needed to be processed. The library species needed their midday channeling cycle. She picked up her tools. She went back to work. She found the first journal at the back of the shelf, behind the newer volumes. Pushed to the rear by the accumulation of 4 years of documentation that had grown up around it the way undergrowth grows around an old stone. Gradually, without intention, until the stone is half hidden and you have to know to look for it. It was not a cultivation journal. It was older than those, with a different cover, worn brown leather. The edges softened by years of field handling, and it contained not botanical observations, but the research she had compiled during her 12 years in the eastern settlements. Plant behavior studies, compound efficacy documentation. The proposal she had written and rewritten 7 times before she had been satisfied enough with it to submit it to the Royal Medical Council's Open Scholarship Program. The program that had brought her to the palace. The program that had ended in the council chamber on a Tuesday afternoon in early autumn. 4 years ago, in the space of approximately 4 minutes. She sat down on the moss with the journal in her lap and did not open it. She already knew what was inside. But holding it was enough to open the door. She kept carefully shut in the part of her mind where that Tuesday lived. And the memory came through the way it always came, fully immediately with complete sensory detail. The council chamber had been larger than she expected. She had imagined something intimate, a working room, a table of physicians who were there to engage with the research rather than to perform engagement for one another. What she found was a formal hall with tiered seating along 3 walls, filled with every royal physician and medical council member and administrative observer who had apparently found the presentation of an Omega herbalist from the eastern settlements sufficiently novel to warrant attendance. There were 60 people in the room when she walked to the presentation table, and the quality of their attention was the particular attention of people who have already formed their opinion and are present to confirm it. She had not let herself feel that. She had set her journals on the table, opened to her first documentation sequence, and begun. She had been 4 minutes into her presentation. She had reached the 3rd compound study, the silverroot efficacy data, which was the most unambiguous evidence in her entire body of research, when the king spoke. He had been seated at the center of the upper tier, slightly elevated above the other council members, in the chair that was not quite a throne but communicated the same information. She had been aware of him the way you were aware of weather, as a condition of the room rather than a specific presence, and had directed her presentation at the full council rather than at any individual. His voice was not loud. That was the thing she remembered most precisely, that he had not needed volume, because the room's attention shifted to him the moment he drew breath. And the shift was so complete and so immediate that her own voice simply stopped. The way a stream stops when a stone is placed in it. He said her methods were anecdotal. He said her documentation, while thorough for field research, did not meet the evidentiary standards required by the Royal Medical Council for formal consideration. He said that botanical knowledge of the type she was presenting, practical, observation-based, rooted in rural tradition rather than institutional training, was valuable in its place, which was not this place. He used the word embarrassment. She was not certain, in the years of replaying the memory, whether he had directed it at her specifically or at the situation generally. It did not ultimately matter. The word had landed where it landed. The laughter had not been universal. It had been maybe a third of the room, the particular third that monitored the king's reactions carefully and responded to them quickly, whose social survival depended on correct alignment with his expressed opinions. but a third of 60 people in a stone chamber with good acoustics was enough. She had been escorted to the basement that same afternoon by an administrative assistant who apologized twice in the tone of someone apologizing for weather rather than for a human decision. She had been given a door key and a meal schedule and nothing else. She had not cried. She had made that decision on the walk down the stairs, a quiet, internal decision, made in the part of herself that she trusted most, that she was not going to spend the resource of her grief on a room full of people who had not been worth her presence. She had opened the basement door instead, and looked at the empty chamber and begun. Now she closed the first journal and held it for a moment. Outside the forest, faintly through the walls, she could hear new sounds in the corridor above. Voices, more than usual, moving with the particular urgency of a household that had received news it did not know how to process. The trembling in her hands was worse. She set the journal back on the shelf. She stood carefully, testing her balance. She had work to do, and she intended to do it. She made it 3 steps before the forest floor came up to meet her, and the green closed over her like water, and everything went quiet. Physician Davin's report reached the upper palace at the 8th bell. He had written it in the corridor outside the basement door, sitting on the stone floor with his back against the wall and his medical journal open on his knee. Because he had not trusted himself to remember everything correctly if he waited until he returned to his office. He wrote for 20 minutes without stopping, and when he finished he read it back to himself and found that it sounded like the work of a man who had lost his professional composure, which was accurate, and decided to submit it anyway because accuracy was more important than composure when the situation was sufficiently extraordinary. The report described the forest. It described the species he had identified, 14 of them, extinct by the Royal Medical Compendium's own records, growing at full maturity in a basement chamber that received no natural light and had been assigned to a single Omega herbalist 4 years ago as a storage assistance post. It described the cataloging system, 12 journals meticulously maintained, documenting 4 years of cultivation and compound research. It described the smell of the air in the chamber, which he included not as sentiment, but as medical observation. The oxygen quality was measurably different from the palace air above, richer and more complex. The signature of a plant ecosystem operating at extraordinary biological efficiency. And it described the woman on the floor. Sylvaine of the Eastern Settlements, currently listed in the palace administrative records as lower service staff, basement level, had been found unconscious at the center of the forest. Her vital signs were stable, but her physical condition indicated significant systemic depletion. The specific presentation. Davin wrote with the careful language of a physician who wanted to be precise, of someone who had been sustaining a continuous biological output at a level exceeding what the body could replenish through normal rest and nutrition. She had been carried to her sleeping quarters at the corridor's far end and was being monitored. He submitted the report to the king's administrative secretary and went back downstairs to sit with her. The report passed through 3 sets of hands before it reached Aldrich, each pair adding a layer of institutional processing that had the collective effect of making something extraordinary sound routine by the time it arrived at the king's desk. The secretary had attached a brief summary note. The summary note described the situation as a personnel medical incident requiring attention and referenced the botanical findings as potentially relevant to the current Eastern Plague crisis. Potentially relevant. Aldrich read the summary note first, as he always read summaries first, because the volume of documentation that crossed his desk daily made full reports a privilege reserved for matters of confirmed significance. He read potentially relevant and was about to set it in the follow-up stack when something made him stop. He picked up the full report instead. He read it once quickly, the way he read things when he was looking for the shape of a situation before committing to its details. Then he read it again slowly, which was not something he often did. and the second reading produced in him a quality of stillness that his administrative secretary, who had worked with him for 9 years and knew his reading expressions with some precision, would have found notable if she had been present to observe it. 14 extinct species. 12 journals. For years. He set the report down. He picked up the Eastern Plague dispatches that had arrived that same morning. 17 settlements affected. The royal physician's standard antimicrobial protocol producing no measurable improvement in patient outcomes. A projected escalation rate that his chief medical advisor had described in her accompanying note as deeply concerning. He held the plague dispatches in one hand and Davin's report in the other, and looked at both of them for a long moment. The plague dispatches mentioned Thornvale moss. His chief medical advisor had included it in a list of theoretical treatment compounds. Annotated with the note, last recorded specimen 3rd century, synthesis attempts unsuccessful, considered non-viable. She had included it as a historical footnote. The kind of thing you mention to demonstrate thoroughness rather than because you expected it to be actionable. Davin's report mentioned Thornvale moss also. Growing at full maturity. 3 healthy specimens. Compound concentration at peak. Aldrich stood. He did not summon his escort. He did not notify his secretary. He walked out of his study and down the main corridor and through the service door that connected the palace's formal levels to its operational lower floors. And he descended the stairs with the particular focus of a man who has understood something and is moving toward the full understanding of it. The basement corridor smelled different from the moment he stepped off the bottom stair. He stopped and breathed it in, the same quality Davin had documented, the richness of it, the living density. He had walked this corridor before, years ago, during a security review of the palace's lower levels. He remembered it as stone and stillness, and the particular emptiness of a space that held nothing of consequence. He walked to the last door on the left. He stood in front of it for a moment. The smell was strongest here, pressing through the gaps around the door frame with the insistence of something that had long since exceeded the space it had been given, and was simply, quietly, everywhere. He put his hand on the door. He pushed it open. The forest looked back at him. It filled the chamber from floor to ceiling, dense and layered and alive with a completeness that made the word impossible feel insufficient. He stood in the doorway and looked at what 4 years of a single woman's sustained attention and extraordinary gift had built in the space he had assigned as a dismissal. And he felt something happen in his chest that he did not immediately have a name for. It was not quite guilt. It was larger than guilt and more structural. The sensation of a load-bearing wall in one's understanding of the world cracking cleanly from foundation to ceiling, and the cold air of a more accurate reality beginning to come through. He stepped inside. The door swung closed behind him. The forest breathed around him, steady and vast and entirely indifferent to who he was. He had never, in his adult life, been in a room that was indifferent to who he was. He stood there for a long time before he began to move. He moved through it the way you moved through something you did not want to disturb. This was not a conscious decision. Aldrich was not, by nature or by training, a man who moved carefully through spaces. He moved through rooms the way kings moved through rooms, with the full assumption of ownership. The body's learned knowledge that every space it entered had been, in some meaningful sense, prepared for it. He had walked into war councils and treaty chambers and grief-filled throne rooms with the same fundamental certainty of footing, and that certainty had never failed him. It failed him here. The forest did not accommodate him. That was the precise quality of the experience, not hostility, nothing as active as resistance. Simply the complete absence of the adjustment that rooms usually made. The canopy did not part for him. The undergrowth did not thin at his approach. The air did not change its quality to acknowledge his presence. The forest was simply itself, fully and without apology, and he was a visitor moving through it on its terms rather than his own. He found himself walking more slowly than he had intended, more carefully. watching where he placed his feet with an attention he did not normally dedicate to the question. He began to identify species. This was the part of his education he had retained most clearly, the botanical component of the medical governance curriculum he had studied as a young king, learning the scope of his kingdom's institutional responsibilities. He had been a thorough student, if not a passionate one, and the species names had stayed with him the way things stayed when learned with duty rather than love, reliably without warmth. He had not expected to use them in any direct practical sense. They were catalog knowledge, the kind you carried to demonstrate the breadth of your understanding rather than its depth. He used them now, moving through the forest and naming what he saw.
Welcome back to our channel. Today Mott V brought you a brand new and incredibly captivating story, sure to please you if we watch the whole video. This story is entirely fictional. The video was created using artificial intelligence AI and is designed to provide positive entertainment and educational value to viewers aged Muiba and up. Now let us continue exploring today's story.
And the naming produced in him a growing and distinctly uncomfortable sensation, because every species he named was one he had filed in the category of theoretical, extinct, historical, the kind of plant you read about in old compendiums and accepted as irretrievably gone from the living world. Silverroot. He stopped in front of it and crouched to look at it properly. 3 specimens, healthy and producing, their distinctive silver-veined leaves at full extension. The fever reduction compound. He had read a study on its efficacy last year. A historical analysis based on 3rd century clinical records. The study had concluded that if silverroot were still available, it would outperform every current fever treatment in the royal physician's pharmacopoeia by a significant margin. It had been filed under historical interest, non-actionable. Non-actionable. He looked at 3 living specimens of it and considered that word. He stood and kept moving. Deep moss covered an entire section of the northern wall, climbing in dense layers from floor to ceiling, its dark surface occasionally catching the faint bioluminescent light that the forest somehow generated. He did not understand the mechanism. Added it to the list of things requiring explanation. Deep moss. The respiratory compound that the council's lead researcher had told him 18 months ago was the most promising theoretical treatment for winter lung disease and the least likely to become available within any practical time frame. He had accepted that assessment and moved the research funding toward the synthesis program that was, 18 months later, still producing no viable results. He found the thornvale moss near the forest center. 3 specimens, as Davin's report had stated. Their blue-green fronds at the deep metallic intensity that he knew from the compendium description indicated peak compound concentration. He stood in front of them for a long time without moving. 17 settlements. His physician's protocol failing. The treatment compound growing 40 feet below his throne room in jars he could see lined against the northern wall. 47 of them, sealed and labeled in the same precise handwriting that filled the journals on the shelf. He went to the journals. He pulled the first volume from the shelf and opened it, and within 2 pages understood that he was reading something that was not simply field documentation. It was, in the truest sense of the word, a masterwork, the accumulated botanical intelligence of a person who combined 12 years of field expertise with a gift that operated at a biological level beyond anything his medical establishment had encountered, documented with a precision and clarity that made his chief medical advisor's research reports feel, by comparison, like approximations. He read for an hour without moving from the spot. The journals documented everything: cultivation methods, compound extraction processes, efficacy data from self-administered tests and careful observation, cross-references to historical medical texts, notes on species interactions, and the compound combinations that produced effects no individual plant achieved alone. Volume 7 contained a section on the Eastern Plague. She had anticipated it, documented it, prepared for it, 2 years before his physicians had classified it as a significant threat. 2 years. He closed the 7th volume and opened the 12th. The most recent entries were dated 3 weeks ago. The handwriting in the final pages was slightly different from the earlier volumes, still precise, still clear, but with a quality he recognized from documents produced under physical strain. A faint irregularity in the letter forms. The specific inconsistency of hands that were not entirely steady. He had seen that handwriting quality before, in dispatches from field commanders who had been without sleep for extended periods. In reports produced by advisors working through illness. In the correspondence of people who were continuing to work past the point where their bodies were cooperating. He closed the journal. He looked at the shelf, 12 volumes for years. A complete and extraordinary record of work conducted in isolation, in the dark, in a space assigned as punishment, by a person whose physical condition now reflected the cost of sustaining it. He stood in the forest's deep center and understood, with the cold and specific clarity of a man who prided himself on accurate assessment, that the assessment he had made 4 years ago in the council chamber had been wrong, not incomplete, not partially correct, wrong, fundamentally and consequentially wrong, in ways that had cost his kingdom measurably and cost her immeasurably, and the wrongness had been entirely his. He heard a sound from the corridor. He turned. The door to the sleeping quarters at the far end of the corridor was open. In the dim light beyond it, someone was moving. Consciousness returned to Sylvaine the way it always returned after deep channeling, not all at once, but in layers, each one adding a dimension of awareness until the full picture assembled itself, and she understood where she was and what had happened. The first layer was physical, the familiar texture of her sleeping mat beneath her, the smell of the forest drifting through the open doorway between her quarters and the corridor, the specific quality of underground air that she had learned to read the way surface dwellers read weather. She was in her room. She was lying down. Someone had placed a folded cloth under her head. The second layer was temporal. The light filtering under the corridor door was the particular pale quality of midday, which meant she had been unconscious for at least 4 hours, possibly more. She had lost a morning. She catalogued this information with the same steady attention she brought to everything and felt, beneath the steadiness, a flicker of something that was not quite fear but was adjacent to it, the recognition of a body that had crossed a threshold it had been approaching for weeks. The third layer was the sound. Someone was in the forest. She lay still for a moment after she understood this. Not from weakness, but from the deliberate stillness of a person taking stock before acting. The footsteps she could hear through the corridor were measured and slow, not the footsteps of the overseer who occasionally appeared at the top of the stairs. Not the quick efficiency of a kitchen worker on a delivery errand. These were the footsteps of someone moving through the forest carefully, pausing frequently, taking time with what they were encountering. She sat up. The room shifted slightly but held. She pressed her feet to the floor and stood, and her body registered the effort more than it should have, but less than she had feared. She straightened her clothing. She walked to the doorway. He was standing at the journal shelf with the 12th volume open in his hands, his back to the corridor entrance, reading with the focused stillness of a person who had been there long enough to have forgotten, temporarily, that they were somewhere they had arrived uninvited. Sylvaine stood in the doorway and looked at him. She recognized him immediately. There was only one person in the palace who stood that way, with that particular quality of unconscious ownership that years of kingship inscribed in the body, so deeply it was present even in moments of stillness. She had not seen him in 4 years. He was largely unchanged. She was not sure what she had expected. That consequence would have marked him somehow. That 4 years of making decisions whose costs she had borne would be visible on his face. It was not, particularly. He looked like what he was, a man in the middle of his life, reading something that had arrested his complete attention. She watched him turn a page. She watched him stop. She watched him read the same section twice. which she recognized because she had written it under a particular kind of focus, and the reading of it tended to produce a pause. Then he turned and saw her. Neither of them spoke. This was not awkward. It was the specific non-awkwardness of a situation so weighted with unspoken history that ordinary social friction could not find purchase in it. He looked at her with an expression she catalogued carefully. Not the confident dismissal of the council chamber. Not the political assessment of a king encountering a problem, but something more uncertain and more genuine. The expression of a man who had been reading for an hour and had arrived somewhere he had not anticipated. She crossed the forest to her workbench and sat on the stool there, because her legs had expressed a preference for it, and she saw no reason to override them. She looked at him across the middle distance of the forest floor. He spoke first. His voice was the same as she remembered, not loud, not requiring volume to carry authority. He asked about the Thornvale moss. Specifically, he asked about the compound concentration indicator she had documented in Volume 7, the relationship between frond coloration and peak extraction timing. His question was precise and technically informed. The question of someone who had read her documentation carefully rather than skimmed it. She answered, not because he deserved the answer. That calculation was separate and more complicated, but because the plant deserved to be understood correctly. An imprecise knowledge about compound extraction timing could compromise treatment efficacy, and 17 settlements were waiting. She told him the coloration moved through 3 distinct phases, and that the metallic intensity he would have observed on the current specimens indicated they were at the midpoint of the peak window, which gave a 3-day extraction margin before concentration began to decline. She told him the extraction method was documented in Volume 9, pages 42 through 47, and that the process required specific temperature conditions she had established in the northern section of the forest. He listened with the full and focused attention of someone who was not performing interest, but actually had it. This was different from the council chamber. In the council chamber, he had not listened at all. She filed the difference away without assigning it more weight than it currently warranted. He asked a second question, about the deep moss, the compound interaction she had documented between deep moss and silverroot, when prepared in combination rather than separately. She answered that too. He asked a third question, and then a fourth, and with each question she felt the conversation acquire a different quality. Less interrogation, more exchange, the gradual emergence of a dialogue between two people who were, whatever else they were to each other, both genuinely interested in the same subject. After the fourth question, he was quiet for a moment. Then he closed the journal and looked at her directly and said her name. Sylvaine. Both syllables, the accent placed correctly on the second. Not Sylvaine, which was how the administrative assistant had pronounced it on the day of the basement assignment, not Sylvain, which was how the kitchen worker who left her meals had pronounced it on the one occasion she had spoken it aloud. Not the flattened generic approximation that most people defaulted to when they had not considered that a name was worth learning. Her own name, pronounced correctly, by the person who had the least right to the intimacy that correct pronunciation implied. She looked at him for a long moment, measuring what the gesture was worth and what it was not. It was not enough. It was also not nothing. She filed it in its correct category and held his gaze and waited to see what he would do with the silence she gave him back. He did not fill it immediately. He stood with her journal in his hands in the forest he had found in the space he had assigned as her erasure, and he breathed the air she had spent 4 years cultivating, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who was beginning, slowly and at considerable personal cost, to understand something true. The Thornvale compound reached the eastern settlements on the 3rd day after Aldrich's first visit to the forest. Sylvaine had prepared it herself, working from the northern storage wall, where her 47 jars waited with the patient readiness of things that had been made for a purpose and were finally being called to it. The preparation process required 4 hours of sustained attention, not channeling, simply the precise physical work of compound extraction and stabilization that she had documented in Volume 9 and could perform, even in her current depleted state, with the reliability of long practice. Aldrich had arranged the courier dispatch without asking her how she wanted it handled, which she noted and did not comment on. When the first cart left the palace grounds loaded with sealed treatment containers, she watched it go from the top of the basement stairs, the highest point she had reached in the palace in 4 years, and felt something she identified, after a moment's honest examination, as relief. Not vindication. Relief. The specific release of a person who has been carrying the knowledge of a solution to a problem that was hurting people and has finally been permitted to apply it. She went back downstairs. She had work to do. What she had not anticipated was that Aldrich would return. He came back the following morning, at the 7th bell, without announcement. She heard his footsteps on the basement stairs and recognized their quality, and continued her work without adjusting anything about her posture or her activity. Because she had decided, in the quiet of the previous evening, that she was not going to perform any version of herself in his presence that was different from the version that existed when he was not there. He entered the forest and found her in the library section, performing the midday channeling cycle for the silverroot specimens. The channeling was visible, if you knew what to look for. A slight luminescence at her fingertips where they touched the soil, a quickening in the plant's surface movement. The particular quality of attention in her face that distinguished active channeling from ordinary tending. He stopped at a respectful distance and watched. She finished the cycle for the 3 silverroot specimens, moved to the deep moss, began the same process. She was aware of him watching with the quality of focused observation he had brought to reading her journals, not casual, not intrusive, but the genuine attention of someone trying to understand something they had not previously had access to. After the 3rd specimen, she stopped and looked at him. He asked how long the daily channeling cycle took. She told him, 2 hours for the full forest. Longer on days when specific specimens needed additional support. He asked if it was physically taxing. She considered the question for a moment, not its honesty, which was straightforward, but how much of the answer to give, and told him that the sustained output across 4 years had accumulated a deficit that single nights of rest could not address. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked how long she had been showing physical symptoms. She told him 3 weeks, which was true but not complete. The complete answer was that the minor symptoms had begun 18 months ago, and she had managed them successfully until 3 weeks ago when the management had stopped working. But she did not offer the complete answer, because it was not what he had asked. He moved closer, not to her, to the specimens she had been tending, crouching to look at the silverroot with the focused attention of a physician examining a patient. He asked about her nutrition, about her sleep patterns, about the specific nature of the trembling she had been experiencing. She answered each question with the same precise brevity she brought to everything. And as she answered, she noticed something that she filed with careful attention. He was not asking as a king gathering information relevant to a resource. He was asking the way Davin asked, with the particular quality of concern that was not performed, that did not require anything in return. That was simply the honest response of a person who had registered that someone in front of them was not well. She was not accustomed to being asked about her physical condition by anyone except Davin. The experience of it, coming from this specific person, produced a complicated interior response that she examined honestly and set aside for later consideration. He stood. He looked at her directly. His expression had the quality she had observed in the forest on his first visit, that structural honesty. The look of a man who had found himself somewhere his certainty did not reach, and was navigating it without the usual tools. He said, "You have been sustaining this for 4 years. Alone. In a space I assigned specifically, so that you would not be able to do anything meaningful." It was not quite an apology. It was the statement before an apology, the accurate accounting of what had happened, delivered without the softening that would have made it easier for him to say, and less true in the saying. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the council chamber. She thought about 4 years of meals left on the second stair-step. She thought about 47 jars of Thornvale compound that were currently traveling to 17 settlements where people were dying of something she had been able to treat for 2 years. She said, "Yes, that is what happened." 4 words, plain and complete, without anger and without absolution. Simply the accurate answer to an accurate statement. He held her gaze. He did not look away from what she gave him. Outside, in the eastern settlements, the first patients were beginning their treatment. And in the basement forest, the unknown plant at the chamber's deepest point pulsed once with its strange reciprocal warmth, as though it had been listening and found the exchange, if not sufficient, at least honest. The first recovery report arrived on a Friday. Aldrich read it at his desk in the early morning, before his secretary arrived, before the day's administrative machinery began its reliable and consuming operation. The report was from the eastern settlement of Varon, population 412, plague cases numbering 63. All 63 treated with Sylvaine's Thornvale compound over a 4-day period. Current status: 58 recovered, 5 in continued treatment with improving indicators. 0 fatalities since treatment began. He set the report down. He picked up the corresponding report from his chief medical advisor, which covered the same settlement for the prior 2 weeks under the royal physician's standard protocol. 63 cases treated, 11 fatalities, 41 with no measurable improvement. He held both reports in his hands and looked at the numbers for a long time. The second settlement report arrived before midday. 41 cases, 39 recovered. The third arrived that afternoon. The pattern was the same across every settlement. The Thornvale compound worked consistently and completely, at a success rate that his medical establishment's most optimistic projections had not approached with any treatment currently in their pharmacopoeia. He called for the complete file on the Eastern Plague research that the Royal Medical Council had conducted over the previous 2 years. His secretary produced it within the hour, 4 volumes, the work of his 12 most senior physicians, representing an institutional research investment of considerable magnitude. He read through the executive summaries of each volume with the thorough and honest attention he was bringing to everything connected to this subject now. And what he found in the summaries was not negligence or incompetence, but something that felt, in the current context, almost worse: the complete absence of Thornvale moss from any research avenue, because the compound had been classified as non-viable before anyone had looked for it seriously. Non-viable because extinct. Extinct because no one had looked. No one except a woman in a basement. He closed the research file. He stood and walked to the window that faced the palace's lower eastern face, where the service levels occupied the ground floor and the basement below it. He looked at the stone exterior of the building that held the forest and considered. With the careful and honest assessment he was finding increasingly necessary and increasingly uncomfortable, what 4 years of that woman's presence in that basement had produced. She had anticipated the Eastern Plague 2 years before his physicians classified it as a significant threat. He had read this in Volume 7 and returned to it now in memory, examining its implications fully for the first time. She had seen the disease pattern in the eastern settlements during her field research period, had identified the causative agent, had cultivated the treatment compound, and had documented all of it in a journal in a basement where no one read it, because he had put her there specifically so that her knowledge would not interfere with the operation of an institution that was, as it turned out, significantly less capable than she was. He thought about the council chamber. He made himself think about it with precision rather than the blurred guilt that was easier to carry, the specific sequence of events, the specific words he had used. The specific decision he had made in the first 4 minutes of her presentation to stop listening. She had been 4 minutes into presenting 12 years of field research. He had listened for 4 minutes and delivered his verdict and had been, in the delivery of it, entirely certain that he was correct. That certainty, its completeness, its comfort, the way it had required no engagement with the actual content of what she was saying, was the thing he kept returning to. He had not been uncertain and chosen dismissal. He had been certain without having earned the certainty. And the distinction mattered because one was a mistake of judgment and the other was a failure of character. He went to the basement at the 6th bell. She was in the deep forest at the unknown plant, sitting beside it with her hands in her lap rather than in the soil, resting, which Davin had apparently persuaded her to do for at least 2 hours each afternoon. A persuasion that had required, by Davin's account, considerably more persistence than it should have. She looked up when he entered, but did not change her posture or her expression, which he had come to understand as her default response to his arrivals: full acknowledgement, zero performance. He sat down across from her, on the forest floor. This was not something he had planned to do. His body made the decision before his protocol did. Drawn by the particular quality of the space, the moss, the warmth, the reciprocal hum of the unknown plant, that he could feel even without her gift. A low and steady comfort that the forest center generated with the easy consistency of breathing. He said, "The recovery reports came from the eastern settlements today." She waited. He said the numbers. All of them, precisely, because she deserved the precise numbers rather than a summary. She listened without visible reaction, but her hands, which had been still in her lap, turned slightly upward, an unconscious movement. The gesture of someone receiving information that landed somewhere deep. He said, "My physician's protocol has not produced a single comparable result in 2 years of the plague's progression." She looked at him steadily. He said, "You knew. 2 years ago. And I had put you somewhere that made it impossible for the knowledge to reach anyone who could act on it." She was quiet for a long moment. Around them the forest breathed its steady, indifferent breath, and the unknown plant pulsed its warmth. And somewhere in the eastern settlements, 58 people were recovering from something that should not have been allowed to spread as far as it had. She said, "I know." 2 words. Neither accusation nor absolution. Simply the truth, offered to a man who was finally ready to receive it. He nodded once. He looked at the unknown plant between them. He asked what it was. She told him she did not know yet, but that she intended to find out. He asked on a Wednesday, which was an ordinary day in every other respect. Sylvaine had been working in the library section when he arrived. Performing the selective harvesting she conducted every 10 days on the deep moss specimens, a precise process that required removing the mature fronds in a specific sequence to encourage continuous production without depleting the plant's regenerative capacity. It was detailed work, the kind that absorbed her complete attention, and she had heard his footsteps on the stairs and registered his entrance and continued working because the harvesting sequence, once begun, could not be interrupted without resetting the plant's production cycle. He had learned, by this point, not to interrupt her mid-process. He found a clear patch of forest floor and sat and waited. And when she finished the sequence and straightened and turned to face him, he was sitting cross-legged with his back against a silverroot trunk with an expression of such unaffected patience that she noted it with the same honest attention she gave everything. He asked if she would teach him. Not teach him about the plague treatment, or about specific compounds relevant to current medical crises, or about anything with a defined practical application that would justify the request in institutional terms. He said, "I want to understand what you know, not for any reason I can point to, simply because I have spent 2 weeks in this forest reading your journals, and I understand that I am standing at the edge of something whose interior I cannot see from here." She was quiet for long enough that a less patient man would have filled the silence. He did not fill it. He waited with the quality of attention she had observed developing in him across their recent conversations. A genuine waiting, not strategic, not performed. Simply the honest stillness of someone who understood that the answer required its own time. She said, "Come here." She took him to the silverroot first, because it was the plant she knew most completely, and teaching began most productively with completeness. She showed him the root zone first, crouching beside the specimen and explaining the relationship between root architecture and compound production. The way the plant's medicinal properties concentrated in specific tissues, and how those concentrations changed across the growth cycle. He crouched beside her and looked where she indicated, asking precise questions that confirmed he had read her documentation carefully and was now trying to move from reading comprehension to direct observation. The questions were good. She answered them without simplification, because simplification would have been a form of condescension, and he was clearly capable of the full answer. Then she showed him the channeling. She placed both hands flat in the soil at the silverroot's base and let the verdant channeling flow at a low, careful level, not the sustained full-capacity output that had depleted her, but a gentle demonstration, enough to show the effect without cost. The luminescence at her fingertips was faint, but visible in the forest's low light. The silverroot responded immediately, a subtle quickening in the leaf movement, a deepening in the silver veining, the specific surface change that indicated cellular acceleration. He watched with complete stillness. She explained what he was seeing, the frequency interaction between her gift and the plant's cellular structure, the way the channeling accelerated the biological processes that produced the medicinal compounds, the difference between what her cultivated specimens produced and what wild specimens of the same species would produce without channeling input. She explained it in the precise and unsimplified language she used in her journals, and he followed without asking her to repeat anything. After the silverroot, she took him to the deep moss, then the grapevine. At each plant she demonstrated and explained, and he listened and asked and looked. And the quality of his engagement was the quality of a person who was genuinely learning rather than performing the appearance of it. At the grapevine, she was showing him the specific leaf formation that indicated optimal harvest timing when he reached out to touch one of the fronds. His hand angle was wrong, the approach that would compress the vein structure and compromise the tissue he was trying to examine. She moved without thinking, taking his hand by the wrist and redirecting it, rotating his palm to the correct orientation before releasing. The contact lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Neither of them acknowledged it in the moment. She returned her attention to the plant. He adjusted his hand to the correct angle and applied it, and they continued. But something in the quality of the silence that followed was different from the silence before, denser and more self-aware. And she noted this with the same careful honesty she brought to all observations and held it at a careful distance for now. They worked through the afternoon. By the 6th bell they had covered 7 of the library section's primary species. And the light in the forest had shifted to the warm, dim quality of late day, and Sylvaine found that her physical reserves, which she had been monitoring with the careful attention of someone managing a limited budget, had held steadier than she had expected. She thought about this as he rose from the forest floor beside the last specimen and brushed the soil from his hands. She thought about what was different about today compared to the days of solitary channeling that had slowly emptied her. She thought about the quality of his attention, the way it met hers directly rather than requiring her to project toward it. The way it had felt, for the first time in 4 years, like the work was happening between 2 people rather than inside one person alone. She filed this observation with the same precision she filed everything. In the category she was quietly building in her internal catalog under the heading of things whose full significance she did not yet know but intended to find out. He paused at the forest's edge and looked back at her. He said, "Same time tomorrow?" She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Bring something to write with." Chief Physician Marin had held her position for 16 years, which was long enough to have developed a finely calibrated sensitivity to threats to its continuation. She was not, by her own assessment, a cruel woman. She was a practical one. She had built the Royal Medical Council's research program from a loosely organized collection of individual physician practices into a coherent institutional framework with standardized protocols, centralized research funding, and a governance structure that protected the integrity of medical practice from the kind of anecdotal interference that had historically allowed unverified treatments to cause more harm than the conditions they claimed to address. She had done this through considerable personal effort over 16 years, and she was, quietly and without apology, protective of what she had built. The forest threatened everything she had built. Not through malice. She did not ascribe malice to the situation, which would have been imprecise. It threatened it through existence, simply by being there, documented and effective and impossible to classify within any framework her institution had developed. The forest called into question 16 years of decisions about what constituted valid medical knowledge and who was qualified to produce it. She had spent a week after Davin's report processing this fact and arriving at her conclusion. The conclusion was clean and defensible and entirely within the legal framework of the medical governance charter she had helped write. Sylvaine had been conducting unsanctioned medical practice. The Thornvale compound had been prepared and distributed without council review, without clinical trial protocol, without any of the verification procedures that the charter required before a treatment could be administered to the kingdom's population. That the treatment had worked was, from a governance perspective, beside the point. The point was process. And process, Marin had always believed, was the difference between medicine and guesswork. She convened the emergency council session on a Thursday morning, in the formal chamber, with all 9 physician council members present. She presented the charge with the confident precision of someone who had prepared extensively and expected the preparation to be sufficient. Unsanctioned medical practice, treatment distribution without council authorization, cultivation of medical compounds in an unregistered facility without institutional oversight. The charter was clear. The charge carried mandatory exile. She had the signatures of 7 of the 9 council members on the formal petition before the session ended. The 2 who had not signed, Davin, whose discovery of the forest had apparently produced in him a philosophical crisis regarding the institution's definition of valid medical knowledge, and a younger physician named Tess who had reviewed the Eastern Settlement recovery data and found herself unable to sign a document exiling the person responsible for it, were noted and set aside. 7 was sufficient. 7 was more than sufficient. The petition was filed with the palace administrative registry at the midday bell. Sylvaine learned about it from a kitchen worker named Brita, who had been delivering a tray to the 3rd floor when she passed the council chamber's open door and heard enough of the session to understand its subject and its conclusion. Brita had worked in the palace kitchen for 11 years, and had been leaving Sylvaine's meal trays on the 2nd stair step for 4 of them, and had developed across those 4 years the particular loyalty that forms between people who share a building and an invisibility without ever having spoken about either. She came down to the basement stairs at the first bell after midday and knocked twice in the pattern she had established as her own. 2 quick, 1 slow, and left the information folded inside the meal tray cloth where the overseer's weekly inspection would not find it. Sylvaine read it in the forest, standing at her workbench with the folded paper in one hand and a deep moss frond she had been examining in the other. She read it twice, with the focused attention she brought to documents that required complete understanding before response. She set the paper down. She looked at the deep moss frond. She set that down too, with the careful placement of someone ensuring that a delicate thing was not damaged by being put down in haste. She stood for a moment in the library section of the forest, surrounded by the plants she had cultivated across 4 years of sustained and solitary effort, and she felt the particular quality of a situation she had been half expecting and had hoped, without real conviction, would not arrive. The council had waited until the Thornvale compound proved effective, until its success was documented and undeniable, and had then moved against her anyway, which told her everything she needed to know about what the charge was actually about. It was not about process. It was about the forest having made them look insufficient, and institutions finding that insufficiency intolerable. She picked up her tools. She returned to the deep moss. She worked with the same steady precision she had brought to every day in this basement, because the plants needed tending regardless of what was happening in the formal chambers above her, and because she had decided, a long time ago in a council chamber on a Tuesday afternoon, that she was not going to spend the resource of her attention on the actions of people who had already demonstrated the limits of their understanding. She worked through the afternoon. The forest breathed around her, steady and indifferent to governance charters, producing its compounds and sustaining its impossible life in the deep quiet of the underground. At the fourth bell, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside the basement door. Not Brida's too quick one slow. Not Davin's measured medical tread. Not Aldrich's careful king-in-a-forest walk. Two sets of footsteps, moving with the specific purposeful rhythm of people who had been given a destination and an instruction and were proceeding toward both. They stopped outside the door. Sylvaine set down her tools. She straightened. She looked at the door with the level and unhurried gaze of someone who had been here before, not in this corridor, but in this moment. The moment of waiting for a door to open and finding out what was on the other side of it. She had survived that moment once. She intended to survive it again. The two sets of footsteps belonged to a palace administrative officer and a council herald, which Sylvaine identified the moment the door opened by the specific combination of their uniforms and the document the herald carried, a formal petition scroll in the red-banded wrapping that indicated a governance charter action. She had seen that wrapping once before, for years ago, when a different scroll in the same wrapping had informed her of her basement assignment. The administrative officer delivered the notification with the careful neutrality of a professional, who had been briefed on the voice restriction that no longer legally applied and had not yet updated his briefing. He spoke to the middle distance rather than to her directly, explaining that a formal charge of unsanctioned medical practice had been filed against her under Article 31 of the Medical Governance Charter, that a hearing had been scheduled for 7 days hence, and that she was required to remain within the palace grounds until the hearing's conclusion. The herald placed the scroll on her workbench, and they left. She did not touch the scroll for a long time. She stood at the workbench and looked at it with the honest and unflinching attention she brought to things she needed to understand fully before deciding what to do with them. The red-banded wrapping. The council seal. 7 days. She was still looking at it when she heard Aldrich's footsteps on the stairs. He came faster than usual, not running, but with a purposefulness that was different from his recent arrivals, which had acquired a quality of deliberateness, of a man managing his own eagerness to be in a particular place. Tonight the deliberateness was gone. He pushed the forest door open and came directly to the workbench and looked at the scroll and then at her. He said, "I know about the petition." She waited. He said that Davin had brought him the information an hour ago, that he had read the charter provision and understood its mechanism, and that the charge, as filed, met the technical requirements for proceeding to a hearing with exile as the mandated outcome if the council vote reached the required threshold. He said all of this with the clear and precise delivery of a man who wanted her to have complete information, and she received it with the same completeness. Adding it to the picture she had already assembled from Brida's note and the scroll on her workbench, and her own understanding of how institutions protected themselves. She reached for a piece of paper. She wrote, "What do you intend to do?" She turned it toward him. He read it. He was quiet for a moment, not the uncertain quiet of someone who did not know. but the considered quiet of someone who had made a decision and was choosing how to present it honestly. He said that the Crown held the authority to challenge a governance charter action before a hearing, on grounds of procedural conflict with existing royal medical mandate. He said he had consulted his legal advisor that afternoon, and the grounds were solid. He said he intended to file the challenge before the end of the week. He paused. Then he said, "I want to be clear that I am not doing this as a political calculation. I am doing it because the charge is being used to punish you for work that has saved lives and that the Council's own failures made necessary. And because I put you in a position where that work could be characterized as unsanctioned in the first place. And both of those things are my responsibility to address." She looked at him for a long time. She picked up her pen. She wrote, "If you challenge the petition and the Council escalates, the hearing becomes a public proceeding. Everything I have documented will be entered into the formal record. The Council's treatment outcomes alongside mine." She paused. She wrote, "They will not survive that comparison." She turned the paper toward him. He read it. Something moved across his face, not surprise at the content, she thought, but at the quality of it. The strategic clarity of it. The fact that she had already mapped 3 moves ahead of the current position. He said, "I know." She wrote, "Then you understand that challenging the petition is not a protection of me. It is the first move in dismantling the institution as it currently operates." He read this. He looked at her directly. He said, "Yes, I understand that." She held his gaze and measured what she found there. Not the certainty of the Council chamber. That certainty was gone, and she did not miss it. What she found was something more durable and more honest. The specific steadiness of a person who has identified the right thing to do and has accepted the cost of doing it. She reached for a plant cutting from the propagation tray at the end of her workbench, a small grapevine cutting she had been preparing for transplanting, its root nub wrapped in damp moss, healthy and ready. She held it out to him. He took it. He looked at it in his hand with the careful attention he had been bringing to plants since she had begun teaching him, noting the root structure, the leaf formation, the specific quality of the stem. She wrote one final note and placed it on the workbench between them. It read, "Keep it watered. It does not respond well to being ignored." He looked at the note. He looked at her. A quality crossed his face that she catalogued with precision and set aside in the section of her internal archive reserved for things whose full significance required more time. He turned toward the door. His hand was on the frame when she spoke. Her voice was quiet but entirely steady, carrying in the forest's warm air with the ease of something that belonged in the space. She said, "If the Council destroys the forest, there are species here that exist nowhere else in the world. Some things, once lost, do not come back." He stopped. He stood in the doorway with the grapevine cutting in his hand and did not turn around. But the quality of his stillness changed completely, deepening, absorbing. The stillness of a person receiving something that has landed in a place beyond strategy. She was not speaking only about the plants. He knew it. She knew he knew it. He stood there for a long moment. Then he walked out into the corridor, and his footsteps going up the stairs were slower than they had been coming down. The Council chamber looked exactly as she remembered it. This was the thing Sylvaine noticed first, walking through the door on the morning of the hearing with her 12 journals carried in a canvas bag across one shoulder, that the room had not changed in 4 years. The same tiered seating along 3 walls. The same formal arrangement of the Council table at the center. The same quality of light from the high windows that made everything in the chamber look simultaneously important and cold. Even the chair at the center upper tier, where Aldrich had sat 4 years ago when he delivered his verdict in the first 4 minutes of her presentation, was the same chair, occupied now by Chief Physician Marin with the settled authority of someone who had been sitting in this room for 16 years and intended to continue doing so. The room was full. More full, Sylvaine assessed as she walked to the center table, than a routine governance hearing warranted. Word had traveled. The way word traveled in institutions when something significant was happening, through the specific channels of professional anxiety. The informal networks of people who understood that the outcome of this proceeding would reconfigure something fundamental about how their working world operated. She recognized faces from her original presentation 4 years ago. Several of them looked away when she looked at them. Several did not. She set the canvas bag on the center table. She sat down. She folded her hands in front of her and looked at Marin across the chamber with the same level and unhurried gaze she brought to everything that required her full attention. Marin opened the proceedings with the precise efficiency of a woman who had run 16 years of council sessions and knew the choreography of formal process as fluently as Sylvaine knew the choreography of cultivation. She read the charge. She cited the charter provisions. She presented the procedural timeline. Her voice was clear and confident, the voice of someone who was on familiar ground and intended to remain there. Aldrich sat to the left of the tiered seating, not at the center, not presiding, present. He had told her, when he arrived at the basement the previous evening to confirm the procedural challenge had been filed, that he would be in the room but would not speak unless the proceeding required it. He had said, "This is your hearing. I am not going to stand in front of it." She had looked at him for a long moment and then nodded once, which was the most she had offered to that particular statement, but which he had received with the careful attention he brought to everything she communicated, verbal or otherwise. Marin finished the charge presentation and turned to Sylvaine. Under charter procedure, the charged party was permitted to respond before the council's deliberation. The response had no formal time limit, which was a procedural detail Marin had apparently not considered as a significant variable. Sylvaine opened the canvas bag. She removed the first journal and set it on the table. Then the second. Then the third. She arranged all 12 volumes in 2 rows across the center table with the same methodical precision she brought to her workbench, each one labeled and ordered. For years of documentation laid out in the room, where 4 years ago she had been told that her knowledge did not meet the standards of this place. She opened the first journal. She began to speak. Her voice was quiet at first, not from uncertainty, but from the particular quality of a voice that had spent 4 years speaking primarily to plants, which required no volume and only presence. It found its footing within the first sentences, and then it was not quiet at all. It was the voice of 12 years of field research delivered without apology and without simplification, in the precise and unsimplified language of someone who knew her subject completely and was no longer in any room where she needed to pretend otherwise. She began with the species documentation. 14 extinct plants, cultivated from seeds she had collected during field research, each one representing a gap in the kingdom's medical capability that her cultivation had filled. She cited the compendium entries for each species, the official records of their extinction, the theoretical treatment applications that the Council's own historical research had identified as significant, the documented reality that every theoretical application was now an actual one, growing in the basement 40 feet below this chamber. She spoke without interruption for 20 minutes. The chamber was very still. Marin's expression across the tiered seating had acquired a quality that Sylvaine recognized from plants under stress, a rigidity that was the surface presentation of something working very hard underneath. She had prepared for a response. She had prepared for documentation. She had not, Sylvaine assessed with honest precision, prepared for 12 journals and 20 uninterrupted minutes of a woman who knew exactly what she knew and was no longer in any space where she needed to minimize it. Sylvaine turned to the second journal. She kept going. She spoke for 2 hours. Not continuously. The formal hearing structure required periodic breaks for council members to submit questions through the chair. which Marin managed with the professional composure of someone maintaining the appearance of control over a proceeding that had departed significantly from her projected shape. The questions came in two categories, which Sylvaine identified within the first three and addressed accordingly. The first category was genuine. Davin asked them, and Tess, and two other physicians who had apparently reviewed the Eastern Settlement recovery data with sufficient honesty to arrive at a place of actual curiosity. These questions were about mechanisms, how the channeling interacted with compound production, what the cultivation conditions were that produced the specific efficacy levels she had documented, whether her results were reproducible by trained botanical practitioners who did not possess her gift. She answered each one fully, because these questions were asked in good faith, and good faith deserved complete answers. The second category was institutional. Marin asked most of them, and the three council members whose signatures appeared first on the petition. These questions were not designed to understand her work, but to establish its disqualifications, the absence of controlled trial protocols, the lack of peer review, the impossibility of institutional verification for a cultivation method that relied on a gift that could not be standardized or transferred. Each question was technically valid and substantively beside the point, designed to locate her work outside the framework rather than engage with what the work had actually produced. She addressed these questions differently. Not dismissively, she took each one seriously, acknowledged its technical validity, and then redirected the council's attention to the data that the question was attempting to avoid. She did this with the same methodical precision she brought to her journals, building a structure of evidence so complete and so clearly organized that each institutional objection, by the time she finished addressing it, had been rendered visibly insufficient against the weight of what she had documented. After the first hour, 3 of the 7 petition signatories were no longer meeting Marin's eye. She reached the Eastern Plague data in the second hour. She placed the recovery reports from all 17 settlements on the table. She had requested them from the Palace Administrative Registry 2 days prior, through a written application that Aldrich had apparently expedited, because they had arrived on her workbench the following morning. 63 pages of outcome data, covering every settlement, every patient, every treatment, and its result. She set the council's own treatment outcome data beside it, for volumes of research and 2 years of protocol application, representing the institution's best response to the same crisis. She looked at Marin. She asked her question clearly and without inflection, in the same voice she had been using for 2 hours, precise, complete, entirely unperformed. 17 settlements treated with the Thornvale compound. Recovery rate, 94%. Fatalities since treatment began, 0. She paused. Under the council's protocol, across the same 2-year period and the same disease progression, what is the comparable recovery rate? The chamber was silent. Not the polite silence of an audience waiting for a response. The specific silence of a room in which everyone present knew the answer to the question that had been asked and understood what the asking of it meant. Marin said nothing for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice had lost the quality of settled authority it had carried at the hearing's opening. She said that the council's protocol had been developed under the available evidence at the time of the plague's classification, and that the absence of the Thornvale compound from viable treatment options had not been the result of institutional failure, but of the compound's presumed non-availability. Sylvaine said, presumed. One word. She let it stand in the chamber without addition, because it was sufficient. She closed the 12th journal. She folded her hands on the table. She looked at the council with the level gaze of someone who had said what needed to be said and was now waiting for the room to do what rooms did with truth once it had been fully delivered. Aldrich had not spoken. He had sat to the left of the tiered seating for 2 hours with the expression she had come to recognize as his listening expression, completely focused, completely still, absorbing rather than preparing. He was not performing witnessing. He was simply witnessing, which was the more valuable thing. The council called for deliberation. The chamber cleared except for the 9 physician members and the hearing recorder. Sylvaine gathered her journals. She replaced them in the canvas bag with the same careful order she had removed them, each volume in its correct sequence. She rose from the center table and walked to the chamber's side alcove to wait. She stood in the alcove with her bag across her shoulder and felt. Beneath the stillness she maintained as a matter of practice and principle, the quiet and certain knowledge of a person who has given a room everything that was true and must now wait to discover what the room intends to do with it. The deliberation lasted 40 minutes. Sylvaine stood in the side alcove and did not pace. She stood with her back against the stone wall and her canvas bag at her feet and her hands loose at her sides. In the particular quality of stillness she had cultivated across years of waiting in spaces that were not designed for her comfort. She had waited in worse places for longer periods for outcomes over which she had significantly less influence. She held this fact in mind the way she held everything that steadied her, not as comfort exactly, but as accurate context. Through the deliberation chamber's heavy door she could hear voices but not words. The quality of the sound shifted several times, rising, subsiding. The particular rhythm of a conversation in which positions were being revised under pressure. She noted each shift without assigning it weight. She had placed her evidence before the council with the completeness and precision it warranted. What the council did with it was, at this point, the council's work rather than hers. Davin appeared at the alcove entrance at the 30th minute. He was not supposed to leave the deliberation chamber before the vote concluded, which meant he had chosen to. Which meant something specific had happened inside that he thought she should know. He said, "Marin is losing the room." She looked at him. He said that 4 of the 7 petition signatories had indicated during deliberation that they intended to change their votes. That the Eastern Settlement data, presented in full and placed directly beside the council's own outcome records, had produced in 3 of them a response that overrode their institutional loyalty, not dramatically, not with any declaration of conversion, simply the honest response of physicians who had entered the medical profession because they wanted people to recover from illness and had just been shown, in precise numerical terms, what the difference between her methods and their protocol actually looked like in patient outcomes. He said the vote was likely to be 5 against the charge, 4 in favor. The charge required a supermajority to proceed. It would fail. She said, "Thank you, Davin." He nodded. He returned to the chamber. She stood in the alcove for the remaining 10 minutes and felt something she identified carefully and honestly. Not triumph, which would have been the wrong response to a situation that should never have required a hearing in the first place. Something quieter and more structural. The specific sensation of a truth that has been forced to fight for its right to exist finally being granted the space it should always have occupied. The chamber door opened. The hearing recorder appeared and indicated that the deliberation had concluded and the council was ready to deliver the result. She picked up her bag. She walked back to the center table and sat. Marin read the vote count with the precise neutrality of a professional performing a function she had not anticipated performing in this direction. 5 against the charge. 4 in favor. The supermajority threshold had not been reached. The charge of unsanctioned medical practice was dismissed. The chamber absorbed this in the particular silence of a room that has just experienced a significant reconfiguration of its internal landscape. Then Aldrich stood. He rose from his chair at the left of the tiered seating, not the center chair, not the position of authority. The side chair he had chosen deliberately, and the room's attention moved to him with the automatic and total shift she had observed the first time she ever saw him draw breath to speak. He waited for the shift to complete before he spoke, which was not the pause of a man gathering himself, but the pause of a man who understood how rooms worked and was using that understanding to ensure what he said landed correctly. He did not speak as a king delivering judgment. His voice was measured and plain, and stripped of the formal resonance he used in official address. The particular register she recognized from the best of their recent conversations, the register he used when he was saying something true rather than something official. He said her name first. Sylvaine of the Eastern Settlements. He said it correctly, both syllables, the accent precisely placed. And the correctness of it in this chamber, where 4 years ago it had not been said at all, was not lost on anyone present who had been there both times. He said, 4 years ago, in this chamber, I listened to 4 minutes of a 12-year body of research and delivered a verdict that I was not qualified to deliver. I used the authority of my position to substitute for the engagement my position required of me. And the consequence of that substitution has been borne entirely by the woman sitting at this table and by the people in 17 settlements who waited 2 years longer than necessary for a treatment that was already growing 40 feet below this floor. The chamber was very still. He said, "The kingdom's medical understanding has been impoverished by my arrogance and enriched by her persistence. I want that said in this room, in the formal record of this proceeding, because both of those things are true, and the formal record of this institution has historically preferred comfortable truths to accurate ones." He paused. He looked at Sylvaine directly across the chamber. He said, "That changes today." She held his gaze across the formal space of the council chamber. In the room where she had been dismissed, and where she had just refused to stay dismissed. And she felt the specific and hard-earned quality of a moment that had been a long time arriving and was finally completely here. She did not perform a response. She simply looked back at him with the full and honest attention she gave everything that mattered, and let the moment be what it was. The hearing recorder's pen moved across the page. Every word was going into the formal record. The formal record, from this day forward, would contain the truth. The restructuring took 3 weeks. Sylvaine had expected it to take longer. Institutional change of the scope Aldrich was proposing typically moved at the pace of the most resistant person in the room. And there were several resistant people in the room. But something had shifted in the council chamber on the day of the hearing. And the shift had the quality of a thing that could not be unshifted. The physicians who had changed their votes during deliberation had done so because the evidence had moved them. And evidence-moved people were, in Sylvaine's experience, more durably changed than politically moved people, because their conversion was rooted in something they had seen rather than something they had been told. 3 of them requested meetings with her in the week following the hearing. She received them in the forest, because the forest was her space, and she saw no reason to conduct significant conversations anywhere else. She showed them the specimens, answered their questions with the completeness she brought to all genuine inquiry, and observed in each of them the specific response she had observed in Aldrich during his early visits, the gradual recalibration of a person whose framework for understanding medical knowledge was expanding to accommodate something it had not previously contained. The restructuring session convened on a Wednesday in the formal chamber, with Aldrich presiding and the full council present. He had sent Sylvaine the agenda 3 days prior with a note attached in his handwriting, cleaner than it had been when she first saw it in her journals, more practiced. The handwriting of someone who had been writing things down regularly, asking whether she had any additions or amendments before the session. She had returned the agenda with 2 additions and 1 amendment, all 3 of which appeared in the final version without modification. The first action of the session was the formal establishment of the Verdant Archive as a recognized medical institution under the kingdom's governance charter. The basement chamber and its surrounding lower-level spaces were officially designated as the archive's primary facility, with provisions for expansion into the adjacent storage rooms that had sat unused for the entirety of Sylvaine's tenure in the basement. The archive was granted full institutional standing equivalent to the Royal Medical Council, not subordinate to it, not overseen by it, but parallel to it, with its own governance structure and its own research mandate. The second action was Sylvaine's appointment as Director of Cultivation and Research. Marin had submitted her resignation the morning after the hearing, which Aldrich had accepted with the formal courtesy the situation required, and without the additional commentary that the situation might have invited. The remaining council members received the appointment with the range of responses that Sylvaine had anticipated. Genuine support from Davin and Tess, professional acceptance from the evidence-moved physicians, careful neutrality from the remainder. None of them objected formally, which was the only category of response that carried procedural weight. Sylvaine accepted the appointment in writing, delivered to Aldrich's administrative secretary on the morning of the session in a sealed document that the secretary had apparently found somewhat unusual in format. It was not the standard acceptance letter that the appointment protocol specified, but a more detailed document that the secretary had nonetheless forwarded without comment. The document contained 3 conditions. The first, equal access for Omega healers to all Verdant Archive training programs and research positions, with no rank-based eligibility restrictions. The Archive's knowledge was to be available to every person with the capacity and commitment to use it, regardless of the biological designation the kingdom's hierarchy had assigned them. The second, mandatory field knowledge components in all physician training programs, to be developed jointly by the Verdant Archive and the Royal Medical Council. Institutional medicine and botanical medicine were not competing systems. They were complementary ones, and the training of every physician in the kingdom should reflect that complementarity. The third, permanent legal protection for the forest and its contents, codified in the Medical Governance Charter as an irreplaceable botanical resource of kingdom-level significance. No governance action, council vote, or royal decree could authorize the destruction or removal of any forest specimen without the Director of Cultivation's written consent. All 3 conditions were accepted without modification. She had not expected that. She had prepared for negotiation, had identified the conditions she would yield on if necessary, and the ones she would not, had mapped the likely objections and her responses to each. When Aldrich read the conditions aloud in the session and stated that he was accepting all 3 as written, she noted her own internal response with honest attention, something that was not surprise exactly, but its adjacent territory. The specific sensation of having prepared for a fight and finding instead that the ground had already shifted. After the session, as the council members filed out and the recorder gathered the formal documentation, Davin appeared at her side. He was not a demonstrative man. She had known this since his first visit to the basement. When he had sat beside her unconscious form and composed a 20-minute report, rather than expressing the feeling that was clearly driving him to write so quickly. He stood beside her now in his characteristic way and said simply, "Good." She looked at him. She said, "Thank you for coming down that morning." He said, "I followed the smell." She said, "Most people would have gone back upstairs." He considered this. He said, "Most people had not been looking for that particular smell for 16 years without knowing it." She held that for a moment. Then she picked up her canvas bag and walked toward the chamber door, toward the corridor, toward the stairs that led down to the basement and the forest that was, as of this morning, permanently and legally and irrevocably hers. Behind her, through the chamber's high windows, the afternoon light was moving across the palace's eastern face in its slow and generous arc. In the kingdom's northern reaches, the command frequency relay towers were holding steady. In 17 eastern settlements, people were living who had been dying. And 40 feet below the throne room, in the deep and patient dark, the unknown plant at the forest's center was doing what it had always done, pulsing its quiet warmth, channeling its reciprocal hum, growing towards something it had always known was coming. The forest was different at evening. Sylvaine had always known this, had catalogued it, in fact, in the early pages of her first journal as a purely botanical observation. The shift in biological activity that occurred in the forest specimens as the ambient temperature dropped and the air's moisture content changed. The way certain plants' cellular processes accelerated in the cooler hours while others slowed. The specific quality of the bioluminescence that some of the deeper specimens produced, faint and greenish gold, most visible after the corridor's exterior sounds had stilled and the underground quiet had fully settled. She had documented it as science. She had experienced it every evening for 4 years. As something else, something she had not put in the journals because the journals were for what she understood, and this was in the category of what she simply felt. The forest at evening was the most alive it was all day, and being in it at this hour was the closest she came, in the regular course of her existence, to the feeling she had been trying to describe since childhood to people who did not share her gift. The feeling of being exactly where you were supposed to be. She was at the forest center, beside the unknown plant, when she heard his footsteps on the stairs. She recognized the quality of them immediately, but as she had noticed when he came to tell her about the petition challenge, something was different. Not urgency this time. Something slower. More deliberate in a different way than his recent careful arrivals. The footsteps of a person who had been moving toward a particular moment for a long time and had finally arrived at the last distance before it, and was covering that distance with the full awareness of what lay at its end. He entered the forest and stopped just inside the door. He was carrying something. She could see it as her eyes adjusted to his presence in the low evening light. A small clay pot, the kind she used for propagation work. Held in both hands with the careful attention he had been bringing to plants since she started teaching him. In the pot, a grapevine cutting was growing. Not simply surviving. Growing, new leaf nodes extending from the main stem. The specific evidence of a plant that had been tended correctly and had responded to correct tending with genuine growth. The roots had taken. The plant had committed to the pot, which grapevine did not do easily and would not do for a person who was not paying genuine attention. She looked at the cutting. She looked at him. He crossed the forest to where she was sitting beside the unknown plant and stopped at a distance that was closer than his early visits had been and further than it might have been. The specific distance of a person calibrating carefully. He sat on the forest floor across from her, with the pot between them, and set it down in the moss with the same careful placement she used for things she did not want to damage. He said, "It bloomed this morning." She looked at the cutting. There was a single small flower at the top of the new growth. Grapevine bloomed rarely, and only in conditions of significant contentment, which was a word she had never used in her journals because it was not a botanical term, but which was, honestly, the most accurate description of the specific cellular state that produced the bloom. She said, "That means you have been listening to it." He said, "I have been trying to." He paused. He said, "I find that I have been trying to listen to a great many things more carefully than I used to." She looked at him in the evening light of the forest. In the warmth the unknown plant was producing between them with its steady reciprocal hum. And she felt the particular quality of this moment with the honest attention she brought to everything that mattered. She had been feeling it accumulate across the weeks of his visits, not rushing it, not directing it, simply observing it the way she observed the forest's growth. With patience and accuracy, and the deep conviction that things which were genuinely alive did not need to be forced. She said, "What did you come to say?" He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the quality she associated with his truest register, the plain and uncalculated honesty that she had first heard in the forest when he said I was wrong. That had become the mode she trusted most from him. He said that he was not going to frame what he wanted to say in any formal language, because formal language was what he used to manage distance, and he was done managing distance with her. He said that he had spent 4 years making decisions that pushed her further away, and the months since her collapse moving as honestly as he could in the opposite direction, and that he understood the distance he had created was not erased by the direction he was currently traveling. and that he was not asking her to pretend otherwise. He said, "I am asking if I can continue in this direction, for as long as you will allow it, with full understanding that the allowing is entirely yours." The forest breathed around them. The unknown plant hummed its warmth between them, reciprocal and steady. The resonance of something that had been waiting for the right conditions and had found them. Sylvaine looked at him for a long time. She looked at the grapevine cutting in its pot, with its single bloom and its committed roots. She looked at the forest that she had grown in the dark from 2 bags of seeds and 12 years of field knowledge, and the sustained gift of her own body, which was still here, still alive, still producing impossible things in the space she had been given as a punishment. She reached across the unknown plant and picked up the clay pot. She turned it in her hands. Examining the cutting from every angle with the thorough attention she gave all growing things. The root structure was excellent. The new growth was strong. He had repotted it at the correct time, which she knew because she had documented the optimal repotting window in her 10th journal, and he had clearly read that section. She set the pot back between them. She looked at him. She said, "There is a section of the forest's eastern wall where the light is best in the morning. The grapevine will do better there than anywhere else in the basement." He looked at her steadily, understanding what she was giving him. She stood. She walked to the eastern wall, and she heard him rise and follow. And when she crouched to show him the specific placement, the angle of the pot relative to the bioluminescent specimens that provided the closest equivalent to morning light in the underground, he crouched beside her, and their hands were in the soil together around the base of the cutting, and the forest breathed around them in its warm and living entirety. She did not move her hand away. Neither did he. The unknown plant behind them pulsed once with its strongest warmth yet, a resonance so complete it moved through the soil and into their hands and up through both of them simultaneously. And Sylvaine felt it arrive in her chest with the specific quality of something she had documented in her first journal as a 17-year-old sitting in her mother's garden, trying to find the words for what it felt like when everything was exactly right. She had written, "Like being where you are supposed to be." She had been right then. She was right now. 3 years later, the Verdun Archive trained its 42nd botanical physician. The graduation ceremony was held in the forest itself, not in any formal chamber, not in any space that required the particular architecture of institutional authority to feel significant. The forest was significant on its own terms, the way it had always been, and Sylvaine had decided in the archive's first planning session that the ceremonies marking the completion of its training programs would happen here, in the place where the knowledge lived, so that the people receiving credentials understood from the moment of their receiving that the knowledge was rooted in something alive rather than something administrative. 42 physicians in 3 years. Omega healers who had been practicing in the lower settlements without institutional recognition. Their gift-based methods effective and undocumented. Beta practitioners whose botanical training had been classified as supplementary rather than primary, under the old charter, and who had been subordinating their most effective tools to protocols they knew were inferior. Young students from the eastern settlements, some of whom had walked 3 days to reach the capital when word of the archive's equal access provision reached their communities, and word had reached everywhere, with the specific speed of information that people have been waiting for without knowing they were waiting. The extinct species Sylvaine had cultivated had been successfully propagated in 6 regional sanctuaries, each one staffed by archive-trained botanists who had learned the cultivation principles from her journals and from her direct instruction. The species were no longer extinct. That category had been formally removed from their compendium entries and replaced with a new designation, Archive Recovered. She had written that designation herself, in her capacity as director. In the amendment to the Royal Medical Compendium she had submitted in the archive's first official year. She had written it with the plain and precise handwriting of someone performing an administrative function. She had felt, in the writing of it, something that was not plain at all. The mystery plant had been identified in the archive's second year by a collaborative research team of 3 Omega healers and 2 Royal Medical Council physicians, the kind of team that would not have existed under the old institutional structure. Working in the kind of space that had not existed before the forest made it necessary. They had named the compound it produced Sylvaine, which she had objected to on grounds of professional immodesty, and been overruled by unanimous vote of the research team, Aldrich, Davin, and the 41 archive-trained physicians who had been consulted on the naming question by Tess, who had organized the consultation specifically to prevent Sylvaine from successfully objecting. Sylvaine addressed the kingdom's most intractable chronic nerve condition, the one for which the Royal Physician's Protocol had offered only symptom management for as long as anyone could remember. It did not merely manage the symptoms. In documented clinical application across 2 years of careful trial, it resolved them. The patients who had been managing their condition for decades were, in the precise and beautiful language of medical outcome documentation, recovered. On the morning after the 42nd graduation ceremony, Sylvaine rose before the 4th bell, as she always had. She washed her face. She braided her hair. She walked to the forest. The forest was larger now. The expansion into the adjacent storage rooms had added 60% more cultivation space. And the eastern wall section where the grapevine grew had been opened into what the archive students called the morning room. A long bright chamber where the specimens that responded best to regular tending were kept, and where the daily teaching sessions were held. The unknown plant, the Sylvaine source, had its own dedicated section in the forest's deepest part, tended by the research team with the specific combination of botanical knowledge and channeled attention that Sylvaine had taught them. She did not channel alone anymore. This was the change she had not anticipated and had found, in the experiencing of it, to be the most significant transformation of her working life. She channeled with her students now, and the shared resonance was something entirely different from solitary verdant channeling, not weaker, not stronger exactly, but sustainable in a way that solitude had never been. The forest was fed by multiple streams instead of one, and the multiple streams did not deplete each other. They deepened each other. Her hands did not tremble. She was at the forest's center, her hands in the soil around the Sylvaine plant's root zone. When she heard the soft sounds from the morning room that indicated Aldrich had arrived and was settling into the corner where he customarily sat during her early sessions, not teaching, not presiding, simply present in the way he had become present in this space over 3 years of daily choosing, she heard the smaller sound that followed, the particular happy noise their daughter made when she found something green and interesting, which in this forest was approximately every 4 seconds. 18 months old and already reaching for every plant she could touch with both hands, with complete conviction that the reaching was correct and the plants would welcome it, which they did, every time. Sylvaine smiled at the soil. She kept her hands in the root zone and let the channeling flow, generous and unhurried and shared. The way everything in this forest was shared now, and felt it answered by the plant's reciprocal warmth, and by her students' frequencies joining hers from the adjacent sections, and by the small determined presence of her daughter, moving through the morning room toward her with the focused purpose of someone who knew exactly where she wanted to be. She looked up. Aldrich stood at the forest's edge with their daughter in his arms, both of them watching her with the specific quality of attention she had spent 4 years giving to growing things and had been receiving back, in ever-increasing measure, ever since she stopped growing alone. She said, "Bring her here." He crossed the forest. He crouched beside her. Their daughter reached both hands into the soil without hesitation, and the Sylvaine plant pulsed its warmth over all 3 of them, deep and certain and alive. Sylvaine breathed the forest air, hers, built by her hands and her gift and her refusal to disappear in the space she had been given as a punishment, and understood what she had always known and had spent 4 years proving, that what grows in the dark, tended with patience and given enough time, does not stay in the dark. It rises. It fills every available space, and eventually, inevitably, it finds the light. Her story has come to an end, but our journey together continues. If you found this story inspiring and meaningful, please like the video to support me. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next empowering stories. And if you have any thoughts about the characters, her journey, or want to share your own story, please comment below. I really look forward to reading and chatting with you.